All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Welcome to the Legal Innovation Forum's 2026 webinar series. Today's program is focused on counsel at the edge, advising on strategic risk in public companies. And it's going to be a very interesting discussion indeed. Backing up this webinar is a survey that we've recently done of legal leaders at Fortune 1000 size companies in the US and Canada to find out the biggest risks their companies are facing and how they're helping the companies they work in navigate those risks. And we had about 100 respondents, and we've published it as an ebook, which we'll be releasing in the next day or two, and sending to all the folks in the audience, and some really interesting data-driven insights on what it looks like on the ground for legal leaders navigating strategic risks today. So the purpose of today's webinar off the back of that is to talk about what that looks like on the ground. And I want to thank Litera for partnering with us both on today's webinar as well as the survey and the ebook that we'll be releasing again in the next couple of days. And we have a great group of speakers with us today. And so without further ado, I'll have everybody introduce themselves left to right. So we'll start with Melissa Vierling with Primerica.
Hi, I'm Melissa Vierling. I'm Assistant General Counsel for Primerica, and I work on AI, technology, contracts, and also IP. And I also have 20 years of experience working as an engineer.
All right. Welcome. Thank you, Melissa. Monica.
Hi, everyone. My name's Monica de Martin, and I'm Director Senior Counsel at Societe Generale, which is a French investment bank. I'm here in New York. I do all of their internal investigations. Really happy to be here today.
Okay. Thank you, Monica. Av.
Hi, everyone. My name is Av Maharaj. I am the Vice President and General Counsel of Kraft Heinz Canada. I also run the Corporate Affairs Department in the Canadian business, as well as running the global legal procurement function for the Kraft Heinz company throughout the world.
All right. Thank you. And last but not least, Dennis.
Well, great. Thanks, Andrew. And it's terrific to be here today. Thank you for having me. So my name is Dennis Garcia. I am the Vice President and General Counsel for Litera. I'm based in the Chicago area. I've been General Counsel at Litera now for almost 10 months. Before that, I worked in the Microsoft legal department for a little bit over 22 years. And before that, I worked in-house at Accenture and IBM. I have a unique distinction in that I've spent my entire career in-house and I have never worked for a law firm.
Okay. Very, very unique distinction indeed. Well, thanks, Dennis, and thanks again to Litera for partnering with us on today's webinar. So a few housekeeping things before we start. This is CLE accredited, and so I will be saying 4 CLE code words throughout the session every 15 minutes or so, so pay attention to those. And the first code word is globalization. So again, globalization. So in terms of the themes we're going to talk about in our discussion, we're going to talk about the most significant risks facing large companies today and how your roles are evolving in response. We're going to talk about technology and AI and balancing innovation, governance, and risk. We're going to talk about strengthening influence with other leaders and the board. And then finally, we will close out the discussion about some other key points here. So starting off with, right now we live in, I guess we could say, a very dynamic era. Lots of change. It's been a dynamic decade, and every year has looked quite different in terms of the geopolitical, regulatory, economic, and developments around technology, all shifting rapidly. So let's check in with each of you in terms of what are the biggest sort of challenges in that macro landscape that you're facing in your role, and how has that evolved in the last 5 or 6 years? Melissa, you got to go first on bios, so I'll let you answer this question first.
Great. So a lot of the business risks that I'm seeing right now, or risks in AI, really revolve around technology discussions, right? So it's integrated. It's AI, cybersecurity, privacy, third-party vendor risk management, regulatory compliance, operational resistance. All of these are making such a much bigger impact now that we have AI, because organizations are using more complex systems, more complex AI, integrating multiple systems, and they're really relying on data-heavy decisions. So there's a lot more data, and it's across everything right now, and it's being integrated, right? So with more data, we have more input, data input that we're having, the different types of data that we're having, and we're creating this significant risk threat that isn't just AI per se, it's across all of these technology industries. So it requires legal to have a really deep understanding of technology and the associated risks. About 2 years ago or so, people were saying, oh, you don't have to really know technology to know AI. And now it's kind of becoming absolutely dependent on your knowledge of how does the system work, and and all of the part that's in there. So beyond providing advice from what are the AI regulations, it's really about beginning to get engaged earlier in the decision-making process, right? So regardless of whether you're buying a building, a system, really working closely with your IT groups, your cybersecurity, your compliance, your procurement stuff to understand the technology that's being used, assess the risk, identify any appropriate controls that you have to implement. And I know a lot of this doesn't seem like a purely legal thing, but it does help your risk and lower your risk and understand the risk that you have. It also means sitting in on demos and also getting access to the tools that you're evaluating. I don't think enough lawyers are actually in those tools, playing with them, getting in the sandbox, and actually trying to break the tool, trying to see if it has bias issues, trying to see how accurate it is. Like, get in those tools. The more you know how a tool works, the better it is. Don't just take what the business is telling you. And I always like to say this is trust but verify, right? Get into those systems and really learn for yourself how it's done. Ask the questions on how technology works. Ask the question how the tool works.
All right, excellent. Monica, in your role, and the bank and the financial services sector writ large, what are the biggest challenges at the moment?
I think the biggest challenge for us, and certainly I see it in internal investigations, is this real push by employees who are used to using AI or are getting more familiar with using AI and want to use it as part of their, their job scope. And that's become a bit of an issue, or it's certainly a tension point, as the banks are highly regulated, right? So when we try and bring in new technologies, there's a long lead up to that. Also, in terms of identifying who should have access and whether it's a global application or whether it's just local. So oftentimes I think people are trying to use technology and we haven't caught up yet. And so that's the sort of tension point. And then oftentimes, that new technology also leads into a different way of what are the risks of them using that technology. Does that mean information is leaving the bank? Should we need to put more firewalls? What's our surveillance programs? What compliance policies do we need to bring in? How am I or other investigators in the bank looking at whether there's any foul play or any misconduct there? How do we know what technologies they're using to communicate? Because oftentimes, any sort of nefarious activities sometimes are done off our systems. So I think those are the biggest challenges we're seeing in terms of just keeping up with the pace of change, and implementing strategically so that we're protecting the bank's information, but also assisting people in doing their jobs. Because AI, we're encouraged to use it, we're encouraged to rely on it to make our jobs easier and more efficient. But then on the same hand, we have to just balance those risks in terms of information and data security, and also within a global landscape because we're a global company. So that sometimes creates that difficulty.
All right, great start. We'll come back to a little bit more detail as the conversation continues. At Kraft Heinz, obviously much different than the financial services sector. So what are the core macro risks that business is kind of navigating, and how is your role rolling into helping them do so? Okay. Uh, Ab is on pause, a thoughtful pause. So Dennis, let's move on to
Sure.
you. Two questions. One is that Litera. What are the risks you're navigating right now in this time of change? And it's an exciting time for legal technology. And then, I know you're, working with a lot of your clients. You've obviously spent many years at Microsoft prior to Litera as well. So maybe you could kind of consolidate the sort of core risk landscape that you're navigating in your role, and maybe you're observing some of other folks you're talking to on a regular basis, what they're contending with.
Sure. I mean, I'll share a few things. I think it's no surprise, as some of us have already spoken about, that we're seeing a sort of an increased sort of a regulatory environment. We're seeing more laws, more AI-related laws, more privacy laws. We're going to see more laws across the globe. Litera, we're a worldwide company, and we provide services and solutions to our customers on a worldwide basis. So being able to understand the newer laws which are coming down the pike, if you will, and how they're relevant to us at Litera, how it's relevant to our customers, how do we go and make sure that we're complying with these laws? How do we go and understand what these laws are all about, right? So I think just understanding a increasing regulatory environment and then how to make sure that you're complying with the right laws is something that we continue to be focused on. And I also know that other large companies who do business across the world are hyper focused on. I think as technology has advanced, we also recognize that there's a lot of benefits when technology advances, lots of benefits and pros associated with it. I think technology can also be used against us, could be weaponized against us. We're seeing companies have a greater, concern about cybersecurity and data leakage and those sorts of things. We're seeing more malicious and bad and nefarious actors, right, across the globe, and so trying to infiltrate companies, and so making sure that your cybersecurity landscape is up to speed, that you've got the right insurance, that you've got the right practices and protocols to make sure that hopefully you're mitigating risks in those areas is always a top of mind issue. And I think a third thing is with the growth of technology and legal technology, making sure that you're selecting the right legal technology providers who can help you, companies who hopefully are very experienced, companies who are providing AI solutions like our solution known as Lido, which helps drive business value for our customers, and making sure that you're being thoughtful and deliberate as to who you select from a technology perspective. But those are some of the key things which come to mind from the risk sort of landscape.
All right, thanks, Dennis. I just asked you a question, but you went on pause, so welcome
Yeah,
back.
connection issue. Sorry.
No problem at all. So at Kraft Heinz, it's a very unique company in the sense that it's something that really exists in all of our daily lives. Anyone who goes to a grocery store is interacting with and consuming your products. What are the biggest sort of risks and headwinds that the business is facing these days? And how is your role in advising the business on those risks and navigating it evolving?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, we're 97% of households, at least in Canada. In the United States, it's actually largely similar. So I appreciate all the purchases everyone do, both here in North America and around the world. We are a global company, as you mentioned, and we're everywhere. And that presents a whole set of issues, given the risks we're facing in the world right now. Multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements, right now, not sure whether they're enforced. We're not sure whether they'll be honored. That's going to be a challenge going forward because what was something that people weren't even thinking about 10 years ago now is top of mind of whether a trade agreement is going to be honored is going to be a very significant issue. Political risk, once again, is another issue. But the other issue that comes with that in an organization like ours is single source supplying, and we're used to partner with one organization, and we have contracts with some suppliers that total $500 million, and suddenly that becomes a choke point for the organization. And so there's definitely a lot of risk in the organization, and obviously we've canvassed the AI stuff quite significantly here, and that's just in its infancy. Everybody thinks it's going to change the business. I think the ROI in some business cases have not been played out. I mean, it's going to save time, but it just changes the way you work, and elevates the expectation of employees. But the ROI on a business like ours, in many ways, hasn't played out as clearly as in others, especially in the tech industry. So there's definitely that the risk of your data now seeping through into the public domain is even higher than it has been. And so we've got a whole host of different risks out there. Some understood, some not well understood. The sort of international risks there. I think people are starting to get a handle on it. People are using AI to predict things. We had one individual create an AI tracker about, the price of oil as the issues in the Strait of Hormuz was going up and down, and how do you forward buy? And so there's a lot of ways we can add value in the legal function, getting ahead of things, but also looking around the corner on things like AI. And I've had frequent times where I've had to get up in meetings or conventions and say, okay, so everybody needs to slow down. We need to be trained on this. All of you need to be trained. We're already seeing individuals who are not following protocols and getting themselves in hot water with policies, with their employment in many ways, because they're putting information out into the public domain. So there's lots of challenges out there right now. But it's trite to say, I think these days, which is the only constant, is change. But I think one of the things I've noticed when I became a general counsel, more decades than I care to admit ago, was I've never had a year where I'm like, well, there's nothing going on. I'm just gonna just ride this year through. There's always something in business. Either there's a supply chain challenge, there's a customer issue, there's production issues, there's IP issues. There's always something. And the good thing about legal departments is they're incredibly resilient. So I think we're all up to the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go into a little bit more about how your sort of strategic posture and in advising the organizations you're in has evolved over time, because there is a sort of pattern of constant change. I think it's accelerated change in this decade. I know we've done some podcast interviews with you and over the
Hmm.
years, and webinars, and it's a new major challenge every year. It seems, which is as an observer, quite fascinating to
Yeah.
watch.
And it's interesting you say, and I'm sure you'll get into it, but I think the skills of the legal department and lawyers, individual lawyers in particular, has to fundamentally change. But we'll get
Mhm.
into that, and we'll talk to that. So
Yeah,
stick with
absolutely.
everybody.
Yeah, towards the
So,
end. Yeah. Well, that's a great starting point. So just for our CLE people, the second word is regulation. So second word is regulation, and the first one was globalization. So take note for your CLE accreditation. So just I know we're going to spend quite a bit of time on AI, because how can we not? We've touched on it a little bit. But I just want to talk about in that sort of in this era of change, if there's any sort of structural approach that you've been able to take and evolve in your own practice to help your organizations navigate that change. Melissa, if there's some sort of touchstone or a few touchstones that you sort of look to say, gosh, this is like completely complicated. It's uncertain. And so how can I really be that sort of North Star for the business in helping them achieve a level of certainty or confidence to be able to make decisions in a very kind of complex environment.
There's a lot, and I think part of it is being involved early and regularly, right? So, um, there's a lot of tools out there, and a lot of them can provide efficiency and, so you can do better activities. But I think part of it too is making sure that your innovation is planned and strategic, right? So it allows you to adopt new technologies responsibly, and really making sure how to do that is being involved with the groups to understand those requirements ahead of time, right? So where um, everyone has all these wonderful products that are out there, and hey, I need the newest, greatest thing, but really we need to take a step back and kind of look at, how can we grow strategically and do so within the constraints of cost and everything else in that space. So, part of it is really understanding what your group and your department needs. Like, what are your actual business program problems? Walk through, and other people might have similar problems. So, how do you find like the tool that will work for the most amount of people or give you the most um, benefit to rolling it out, right? So instead of just jumping at the brand newest tool, like really evaluating kind of where that tool is and what you need in that scope. Making that decision probably means that if you're choosing one tool to do multiple things, you're probably spending a little bit more on one tool than you are over two, but you're probably getting better protections, and maybe it'll interact with some more or integrate with some more applications. Um, Tools are very expensive, especially right now, like things that we're doing to implement things. So, a contract management tool, lifecycle management tool, CLM, can cost you over $100,000 a year, and it can cost you $100,000 to implement. And it's going to take time, right? Months to years to get this implemented. You want to make that decision once, and you want to make it the right decision, right? So it's not really just a let's go pick something and go with it. It is let's do the legal process behind it. Let's understand what we need, what works for us, what works for our company. So analyzing those tools is very, very critical. Getting in them, understanding them, not just a quick demo, right? It's really how do you implement all this stuff. And for the AI governance risk type, there are some really good tools that you can use. And if you're in a smaller firm, maybe it's making something to help track you with some AI, right? But there are also inventory tools, like AI inventory tools, that really help. And it's not just keeping track of your use cases, but it's also looking at state regulations to figure out, is my use case in compliance with the state regulations or some of the AI frameworks that you have to kind of help figure out where you are if you're in compliance. And actually, some of these will even integrate with your cybersecurity tools that you have. So if they're looking for over permissioning or vulnerabilities or AI prompt type things, they'll have easy access to your use case. So there are tools that accomplish so many different things in legal, right? And it's really looking at where can we get the most bang for our buck, whether it's efficiency or if it's risk and governance, and analyzing those tools, because you could have every tool if you had limited budgets, you could have many, many tools. But I don't think that's usually the case for a lot of legal departments. It's usually like, okay, we want to have a couple of tools that do the best. So what can we do, and how can we leverage tools that we already have to work for us?
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Monica, in terms of your strategic approach within the business, we had a good question from the audience, which I think actually augments a little bit what I was asking in a more elegant way, which is how do you maintain that strategic posture and see around the corner for the business right now, with this sort of rapid change that we're enveloped in?
I think, as the other panelists have said, there is always going to be change, right? And I think you have to stay true to what your core business is and what are the core risks of your business. So in my opinion, we're a financial institution, that's our core business. So how do we protect that business? And how do we operate within the regulatory landscape that we have? Who are our regulators? What is our business? What strategic moves are we planning on making? What growth areas do we see our business going into? What are the areas that we're going to pull back on? And I think those are strategic, large scale strategic decisions that are made globally, but then how do you implement them regionally, right? And then looking at the instruments, the people, and then now these new technologies coming through. as to how does that better support your business. And I agree completely with Melissa. It's not worth jumping in straight away to the newest, brightest, shiniest thing. Sometimes for us, for the financial industries, you look across and see what the street is doing, right? Where is that impact? What are the regulators focusing on? And of course, with every new administration, there's always a new focus. So sometimes you just have to be agile and then be thinking ahead as to what will be the new focus next year or the year after. And hopefully you've assessed the tools that you have so that you're able to then be in a really good position when those changes happen in terms of what regulation you see coming down. So I think it has to be, again, a balance between what your strategic business plan is, long term, and then how do you implement that locally, right? Because every jurisdiction is different and you have a different workforce in every jurisdiction as well. So locally, what is your push and what are your risks locally, but within that more global framework? So for us, the risks here, of course, are a very different set of regulations than what there are in Europe, working within the boundaries of these regulations, but also being cognizant of the European regulations as well. And then, for me, in terms of investigations, making sure that I'm across whatever technologies we've introduced so that I know what to look for if I'm trying to do an investigation and trying to figure out what people are using or where they perhaps have, gone outside what about our policies and what we're actually requiring our employees to do. Like I have to sometimes be thinking creatively, well, what would I do in that situation? Where would I go? And what would I be looking for? So sometimes just it's a little bit of trial and error maybe, and also just figuring out who has that knowledge, because everyone has a different knowledge base too. So me being able to tap into the subject matter experts here in the bank, either here in the US or globally, to say, what do you know about this? Who's using this? How do we figure that out? Because there's other people in the bank who know that information much more than I do. And that's really sometimes, again, wonderful to have all this AI, but finding the right person who you can talk to, who can explain it to you, as Melissa said, right? Finding those people who can understand the technology and explain it to you and explain how it works. And then I can figure out whether someone's used it in the wrong way, right? Because that's what I'm trying to figure out. So I hope that answers the question.
That is a great answer. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about technology and AI specifically in your organizations and in legal departments. In terms of strategic positioning in your role and seeing around the corners for the business, could you share a little bit about your approach?
Yeah, it's interesting, and like I said earlier, is our skill set has to fundamentally change because lawyers are expected to add value to a business. Sometimes it's naked. You need to add this much back into the business, and other times it's different. I can tell you in the meeting, so my teams, and I have teams around the world on every continent, and it is a struggle to get lawyers out of their comfort zones and to think like the rest of the business thinks. And I think I said this at one of your seminars, Andrew, but sometimes we get into a trap of thinking we are the high priests of knowledge in certain ways, and we're not part of the organization. We're lawyers and we have these obligations. Awesome, but check your paycheck, right? Remember, you've heard me say this before. Everyone check your paychecks. It's the exact same pay stub as the guy in sales, the guy in finance. You all work for the same company. That doesn't mean you all have your own separate obligations and especially fiduciary obligations in many cases. But what it means is you have to start thinking about yourself in that context. And sometimes lawyers are not equipped to understand it. First of all, I turned to my team. Actually, I was a little embarrassed about this, but I turned to my team and said, "Tell me what the 3-year plan looks like." And they looked at me and I said, "What does the top line look like? What is the bottom line? What is our GSV or gross sales? What is our net sales? What is our opera?" Nobody knew. If you don't have those basics, how are you able to advise the business? If you don't understand your 3-year plan, your 10 plan, whatever your plan you have in your business, I don't know how lawyers advise the business. So your question about how do we provide strategic advice is start learning the basics. And if anybody takes anything away from this seminar, once again, yeah, Andrew, I'm sure you've heard me say this is go out and take a 3-day financial course. Each and every one of you. Learn the basics of those numbers I told you of gross sales, gross profit, net operating income, all those things. What goes into SG&A, and you're going to be a much better lawyer. Understand your 3-year plan, 10-year plan. Understand what your leaders are telling you. So then the question is, how are you adding value? Well, once you understand that, then you're understanding how to go about your business. Where should you play in order to add fundamental value? And that may be cost recovery, but it may be avoiding the risks that we're all talking about here. Is it over the water freight? There's a huge risk. How do we reduce that? Is it currency? Is it commodity fluctuations? There's all sorts of things where if you understand your fundamentals, then you should be able to advise in a much more meaningful way. So that's I think that's the basics. And honestly,
Yeah.
it's surprising because we as lawyers don't want to do it. I'll tell you that right now. We don't want to do it because we, in many cases, that's not our comfort zone. When I was in private practice, I used to say we don't take liability, we don't take risk, take ownership of the numbers. That's the client's job. Not in private practice anymore, right? You are like when I am sitting there, I'm doing this right now. I'm setting a piece of litigation. Um, it's fundamental to how we settle this is how I'm going to structure it about which quarter it hits, how much it is, what matters to the organization. Those are all critical questions rather than how can I settle this for the most dollars.
Right.
There's a nuance to it. So sorry to get on my soapbox, Andrew, but
No, that was
I
great.
think this is critical.
We do have a question from the audience. Are there any financial intelligence courses you'd recommend?
I do. There's somewhere in Canada. I will have to dig up those names. I took
Okay.
a wonderful course where actually we went like I actually sat in a room for 3 days, building P&Ls. I've sat in a room like figuring out cash flow statements. And listen, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty. You got to know the basics to be able to talk the language. But I remember once where I was sitting with the CFO and she turned to me and said, how do we structure this? Should we do it on a cost basis or accrual basis? And she was asking me, right?
Right.
And so that's the level I want you all to get to where you're turning to your financial partners and they're asking you these questions. Because they'll then recognize that you are part of the business. You are not, stop saying the business does this and the business does that. You're part of the business. Check your paycheck.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. So Dennis, and I want to talk about this a little bit more too in terms of that these points that Av's just made. But Dennis, you have an interesting perspective because you were working at Microsoft for so long, and now you're Litera, which is in the legal sphere a large player, but relative to Microsoft, quite a bit smaller. So you're the tech GC. What kind of strategic advice are you finding you're helping the business see around the corners of? And for those in the audience who are at large tech companies or smaller tech companies, what could you impart upon them in that sector about how you're looking at this?
Sure. I mean, I'll say a few things. I think, and some of this has already been said. I mean, what you want to do, of course, is be this real strategic, trusted advisor to your clients. And I think the first way to go around to do that is to really earn and build trust with your clients, to really understand from them what are the areas which they're most focused on. What's important to them, what's important to them to accelerate the business and to serve our own customers. And I think as you understand that and you learn about that, then you're going to be in a better position to provide more, um, real, actual, high value legal counsel to your clients. And always sort of staying well connected with them to see how you can to serve them. I mean, from our perspective at Litera, my team and I are focused on moving the business forward and closing key deals with our law firm customers and our corporate in-house legal customers. So we're doing whatever we can to make sure that we're growing our ARR, our annual, revenue every year, basically. And we also need to make sure that we're moving with speed as much as we can, because we're also in an environment where we're facing fierce competition. There's lots of competitors now in the legal tech space, not just sort of the traditional competitors. We have some newer competitors. We have some larger companies who've gotten into the legal tech space too. So we have to move with speed and also differentiate our solutions to our customers the best we can. I think a unique perspective my team and I bring to our team at Litera is that we're also customers of legal technology solutions. So, we understand what a lot of our corporate legal customers are interested in when it comes to legal technology solutions. They want solutions which are easy to use, which really drives, solid business impact, and also is, priced competitively, right? They also want to work with somebody who they has been around for a while and has, a strong brand and reputation. So we're able to bring that mindset, sort of a customer mindset, to some of our business clients, and I think it's helped them sell more effectively to our customers. But I also think, as you're thinking about being a strategic advisor to your clients, you also have to take an outside perspective. Sometimes when we work at companies, whether it's a big company at Microsoft or maybe a smaller, company at Litera, we need to make sure that we're connecting with folks outside of our organizations, make sure that we're connecting with our customers and our partners to understand their challenges and what's on their minds. One thing which I'm trying to do more of now that I'm a general counsel is I've joined general counsel associations and groups. Sometimes being in the GC role can be a little bit lonely, and it's good to get outside, our organization and connect with other fellow GC peers to see, what are the challenges which they're working on, what are they doing in building a world-class legal organization, to share some ideas and thoughts in that area. So I think what all the work which we're doing as lawyers and legal professionals, and we're doing great work internally in our organizations, you can't forget to get outside and get sort of outside of your echo chamber, if you will, and to be able to learn from others, to participate, in events like the Legal Innovation Forum events, right? CLE events, where we get to learn from people outside of our respective organizations. That's so critically important.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks for that. The next question I have is, we're going to move on to the AI section. So I want to break it into two, because we have this AI revolution that we're all living in the midst of right now, which is a fascinating time. And so for the legal department being at the top table, and if you look at our survey, which we'll send out to folks like again in the next day or so, nobody actually in the survey said AI is a bad thing. There was no respondents out of the 100 or so that said AI is bad. It's all good. But the big thing is the risks around data usage, working with third parties. There's all sorts of complexity that's rolling out of this, all the exciting things you can do with AI, and then all the downstream risks that it creates. And so therefore, legal departments are really at the top table when it comes to enterprise AI decisions. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. And then the second part is, well, how does that filter into AI in legal and the impact of AI within legal departments and maybe in the sector writ large from the external counsel you're working with? Melissa, I'm going to ask you first. You and Monica provide nice contrasts in the financial services sector, because Melissa, at Primerica, you have a large set of employees across the country, and selling all kinds of great products to people, but also rolling out enterprise grade AI to these folks, making sure that the risks are managed and balance the opportunity and the necessity to use AI to be successful. Maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about the strategic approach that you're taking. And then as a second question, how does that filter into using AI for the legal work itself?
Um, so I'm going to talk generally about not just Primerica, right, but in the financial
Sure.
sector and different groups. But when you look at an enterprise version or enterprise tools that you're going to work out, you want it to be something that people can use that's pretty well locked down, right? Because um, not everybody has the same AI intelligence that everybody else has. So you want to make sure that there's training that goes along with it, right? So if you have a tool, do they know how to use it, how to roll it out, look at the risks? If you think somebody might enter something, they will, right? So there are things that you can do for enterprise tools. It's a little bit different for custom tools. A lot of people are looking at some custom tools, and depending on who's using those tools, home office employees or Salesforce or whatnot, there are things that you can do to limit risk, which are great. So talking to your IT, talking to your cyber folks, like you can set up a wall so that only certain data can get passed, right? If you put it up in your stuff so that they can't enter PII in, or if they do enter PII in, it doesn't get passed anywhere. So looking at the risks and kind of perceiving what are people going to do. And as I said, if they can, they will. So trying to head off a lot of those risks and how you roll off tools helps, right? You can't be at the point where you don't roll out a tool because they need tools. And if they don't have tools, they're going to figure out a way out of it or figure out a way around it, right? The shadow AI, the things that they're using in the background. So you want to be able to give people tools that they can use. But part of it too is they're going to keep asking and asking for tools. So you need to be able to manage that. And how you manage that is through education and through explaining risk, right? So that they understand when they're even coming to here are the risks that we have or what the understanding is of the tools that they may or may not get. And it might not be just enterprise wise. You might have different groups that get a little bit more access to different tools. So these are your super users or maybe your coding people, that have developers that have different tools and different accesses to tools. So it's not just a one-stop shop of who gets what and where and why and how, right? Finance is a little bit slower to roll out, and I think that's for good reason. We have a lot of protected data, right? So PII and different account numbers and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So in different sectors, you might want to focus on what is the real risk here? And because there's so much data, and AI can aggregate data that couldn't before. It'd be very, very tedious for a human to do it, but it can I would say de-aggregate, but aggregate information in we need to be aware of that. And I think part of that I keep touching upon is talking to your cybersecurity folks and your IT permissioning folks to make sure if you're going to roll something out, have you thought it through? Do you have the back end systems to monitor it or check compliance? Are you ready? Right. And if you're not, maybe it's having those discussions or setting a clear AI boundary or like have an AI playbook for your company of where you are and where you're going to roll out and what steps you're comfortable with and which ones you're not yet. How that affects the legal realm, I think lawyers, like someone touched upon, are a little bit slower to change, a little bit slower to adapt, but they're there. I think sometimes you just need a little hand holding. So like a lunch and learn and let's walk you through it a couple times, right? And as soon as you do, they'll take off on those tools. The risk is a little bit different too, right? Because you have legal stuff that's going into, you have lawsuits and stuff. So you want to make sure that you have the right tools. And lawyers are also the people that are going to use wrong tools. Just because they know some of the risk doesn't mean that they're immune from using tools that they shouldn't be, right? So it's really getting tools for your department that will cover what you need and be protective enough to mitigate the risks. Because the data that you're putting in from a legal department is usually very different than other departments. So,
Okay. Excellent. Great answer. Thank you, Melissa. And sorry, just for the CLE, the third word is governance. The third word is governance, and the first two are globalization regulation. Monica, enterprise risk in a large international investment bank versus usage of AI in legal departments. Any comments on both those questions from your perspective?
That's so broad, Andrew. So I think I have to I have to bring that down just a little bit to my small part of the world in terms of investigations and being part of not just the legal department, but really the broader business thinking. So, a lot of my findings or how my conclusions on an investigation are really tied back to operational risk and what we can do in the bank to prevent that happening again. So, whilst it's all great to have AI and to have all these new technologies, ultimately you're coming back to really what is the conduct and culture that you're trying to establish, right? And I really agree with Melissa wholeheartedly in that if there's an opportunity to do it, people may take it, right? So I feel like that is something that you can't just have as many AI protections as you need, or your surveillance isn't going to capture everything. Your data security, your security is not going to capture everything. People will still, if you have a bad actor, you're going to have a bad actor. And the point is to try and protect the bank as much as possible in terms of that, right? So that means being quick to adapt, trying to learn what people are going to be using, and trying to clamp down on what they are allowed to use within the sphere of banking, right? So what are our parameters? And then trying to think, okay, if they do have access to that, what are they going to do and how will they use it? So it really does unfortunately come down to, again, human nature. So I think it's always a risk, right? You might have a lot of technology, but you've always got humans in there as well, right? So humans will do things that you can't predict. And that's where you have to just be adaptable and nimble, and then work with the rest of your group in terms of compliance, getting a new policy out, getting the training out, reminding people that if you do this, then this is what will happen. So it is about adapting. It's about also being on top of your policies and procedures every year, not leaving them for years on end, revising, going back, adapting, updating. And then if you do have a material update, telling people about it. Because to me, it's not fair to punish someone if there's no way that they could have known that that's a new limitation, right? So you have to be able to police, but also police in a fair way. So that you can, again, balance people wanting to work for your organization, but knowing that there's guardrails that they can't go outside.
Okay. Thank you for being more specific with your answer than my question, Monica.
Sorry.
So Ab, at Kraft Heinz, using AI across the enterprise, implementing it, obviously, I would imagine all kinds of use cases that have been crossing your desk. So if you could illuminate us on your thoughts on that part of it, and then it's rolling down into legal, the application there to help folks become the lawyers that they need to be in their organization to add value, which is what you were touching on earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, so you cut out for a second, but I think you said how does it roll down through the organization, and so
into legal, yeah. How does it,
Yeah.
after so top level down to to legal?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a couple things there. One is people are cooking up all sorts of ways of using AI. I was in one of these hackathons, and this individual created an app in 15, 20 minutes and using AI. And so they're thinking of these ways super fast, especially in the procurement space. It's suddenly become, the thought du jour. The one thing I always want to highlight is mechanical devices have been replacing humans since the invention of the wheel, right? And that has always been the case. An example, we have a facility in Montreal, Canada, that produces about $2 billion of food a year, and it employs about 1,000 people. In 1950, it employed about 7,000 people and produced about one-tenth the amount of food. It's not it's faster machines, it's robots, it's this and that. Like robots have replaced humans in so always. And so I think as people are worried about it, I think that as they should be, I mean, it happens, but at the same time, there are new opportunities that come out for AI. In a larger context, it's happening so quickly that one of the dirty secrets of big companies, and maybe it's the CPG, because I've worked in several CPG companies and a few others I've seen, is that technology implementation is far from universal in most companies, and maybe in the financial industry it's a little different, but especially in CPG it's not. And I've seen that in the auto industry and a few others where it's a little bit of a bolt on here, bolt on there, and to really move the organization into one platform is very time consuming, very expensive. And so what you end up with is a bit of a patchwork. And it takes a real concerted effort of the organization to move into one sort of platform. Um, that's right. CPG is consumer packaged goods, or if you're not in North America, it's FMCG, fast moving consumer goods. Um, uh, but that's what I've seen. So introducing a CRM system, like, yeah, you may use it in North America, but you may not use it in Europe or Africa or Asia. And so getting behind that's a problem. Same thing with AI, how some groups are adopting it really quickly. And so you really kind of have to advise people on how to do this in a more concerted way. And the issues are popping up as we've sort of canvassed about sort of rogue agents going and using AI or taking data out of the licensed realm and putting it into the public sphere, and those sorts of things are a big challenge for AI. Um, but I really want people that listen, it is the shiny new toy, it is the shiny new penny. We have to really get involved in it. But at the same time, let's realize it's another tool out there for us to use. Hasn't taken all our jobs yet. We're not in Terminator mode. We're not in the Matrix yet, but those may come. But at where we are right now is where we have to look at it as a tool that we have to regulate, as a tool that we can utilize but not fear. And so there's a lot of this is an opportunity we have once again as lawyers, because lawyers, and there's a few other groups, but mostly the legal department touches every single part of an organization. And this is where each of you have an opportunity to collate all that information around the organization and provide training, provide guidance that they may otherwise not have. And so these are the opportunities, and look at AI in your legal function as an opportunity for each and every one of you on this call to add fundamental value to your enterprise. That's the way you should be looking at it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Great answer. Dennis, I know you've thought a lot about AI for quite a long time. And so not just since GPT-4 came out. So tell us about how you think AI can be applied in organizations, and maybe to expand a little bit on what others have said. How do you think it's going to transform the sector as we look 3 to 5 years from now? And where does Litera fit into that transformation?
Sure. I mean, a few thoughts. I mean, of course, I'm a big fan of AI solutions and tools. I think when you think about it from a legal perspective and what we've done as lawyers, AI tools right now and will continue as AI tools advance, and they're going to advance and get better over a period of time. But I do think they're going to fundamentally transform how lawyers and legal professionals work. I think it's really going to enable lawyers to get out of some of the more routine, repetitive tasks that lawyers have done for a long period of time, and to free us up to do more higher value, trusted advisor work, which is super critical to our business clients. And I think by doing that too, it's going to help us get back to being lawyers. When I think of when I went to law school, I went to law school to help my clients and humanity and all that kind of good stuff, but to really engage in real lawyering and not do some of the quite frankly, mundane, busy work that lawyers have done over a period of time. And I do think these tools can help us get out of some of that grunt work and do more interesting work and more fulfilling work for our careers. So that's like sort of point one I would start at. Point number two, at Litera, we've got various legal AI solutions. One of our key solutions is known as Lito, Lito. In our Litera legal department, we are using Lito to do a number of things. Like for instance, of course, we have lots of contracts which we put in place with third parties, whether it's NDAs, whether it's customer master terms and master agreements, or maybe independent vendor agreements with other third parties. But we have used Lito to help create our proverbial playbooks for each of those contracts. So Lito has helped us put together sort of our negotiation contracting framework, for our key contracts or fallback provisions. It provides us with guidance on terms we can agree to, some terms we cannot agree to. So it's created our sort of playbooks, if you will. But then we've taken it a step further whenever we get comments from our customers on our standard contracts, which we get a lot of comments, and sometimes we're also working from a third party's contract if it makes sense. But we will use Lito to analyze a customer's comments and propose changes to our customer agreements. We run it through Lito, and it provides us, based upon our playbook, what our fallback position should be, what the alternative wording should be. It will provide us with our talking points as to how we should explain our provisions to our customers. And it's sort of doing a lot of the, maybe grunt work is not the right phrase, but some of the work which we have done in the past as lawyers, but now Lito is enabling us to do that at more speed and in a sort of a richer format based upon our playbooks, which we also update on a periodic basis. So it's helping us practice law, which we think at more of a strategic level, and enabling us to focus on building deeper relationships with the law firms we're negotiating with and with the lawyers who we're working with at our customers, and building a tighter connection and relationship with them, and sort of helping us practice law at a sort of a higher level, if you will. We're also figuring out ways to use Lito as to serve as sort of a deal manager function, if you will. So like a lot of us, when we look at our contract provisions or changes to contract provisions, it's not all legalese. Sometimes we require input from our internal functional business clients on certain provisions and changes to those provisions, which have more business consequences. So we're developing a skill, if you will, within Lito, which will then help us follow up with our business clients when we need their input on important business-focused terms and conditions. And we'll do the follow-up to make sure, if they haven't responded back to us, to follow up again. Sometimes we spend a lot of time following up with our clients who are super busy, but we're going to be able to use Lito and our skill in Lito as a deal manager to do all that. But I think there's other opportunities to use not just Lito, but other AI agents to make our jobs as lawyers a little bit easier, and to free up time for us to focus on other types of important work for our clients. I also think AI solutions provide us with a real opportunity to get back some time in our lives. As we know, and as we get older and more experienced, time is our most important asset. And if we could use legal AI tools to give us back time out of our day, which maybe we could spend more with our family or our wellness or whatever, that's always a good thing, because I think sometimes lawyers have a reputation for working too hard and too long, right? So I think there's a lot of great, which we're seeing right now, potential and possibility to be able to use legal AI tools and agents. That all said, of course, you have to be thoughtful and smart in how you're using these tools. You got to make sure that you're looking at the work, you're confirming the work and the output, that it makes sense, right? So you got to make sure that you're embracing a responsible AI mindset in all of these tools. And then the last thing I'll say is, of course, you want to make sure that you're spending the right amount of time conducting due diligence and selecting whoever your AI solution providers should be, right? And you want to make sure you're demoing those tools. You want to make sure they're easy to use. Hopefully, those legal technology providers have had a long-standing reputation where they have a track record for the work which they've been doing, and hopefully you could trust them from a privacy and security perspective.
Yeah, excellent. Well, great answers, everybody. Thank you so much. Av put it, I think, a really good closing statement in the chat, which I'll paraphrase. Put up your hand when you don't understand something. You'll be shocked to know that you're not the only one in the room. Sit down with your colleagues, understand their roles, challenge your colleagues when something doesn't make sense. You'll be right more times than you're not, and learn about your business inside and out. Couldn't have said it better. So thank you, Av. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Litera, for supporting today's webinar. The final word is, sorry about this here, solutions. So solutions is the final word for CLE. Globalization, regulation, governance, and solutions are the words. Our survey and ebook will be released in the next day or so, and we'll send it out to everybody on here. There's some really interesting insights there that help benchmark. And Av and Dennis are both quoted, and Dennis with some top tips in there. So thank you so much. And thank you again to Litera. Thank you to the audience. We're running a webinar tomorrow on the energy sector. For those of you who are interested, liforum.co. You can sign up there. And I hope you all have a great rest of your days. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye all. Thank you.
Take care.
Where's the time?